Okay guys, strap in and brace for hot takes because it's time for another tough talk. Now, I know there's other stuff going on, but we all knew Suicide Squad was going to be bad and that Kojima and Death Stranding were weird. Now, to be clear, it's not that I don't like Death Stranding or didn't think the trailer for number 2 was cool, I just don't have anything really interesting to say about it. The Silent Hill 2 trailer, on the other hand, is a completely different matter. So that's what we're going to get deep inside of tonight. Okay, ready? I'm pretty sure that Silent Hill is not good. It's not a series, it's not an IP or anything that requires an element of cohesion or shared features and identity. It's a phrase that Konami uses to trick people and make money. That's it. Now, Silent Hill 2 is fucking good. Everything else sucks. Alright, I guess to be fair, Silent Hill 1 is cool as well, but ultimately it amounts to little more than a rough sketch of a good idea that Silent Hill 2 would ultimately perfect. I even like number 3 a fair amount as well, but when those games are honestly compared to Silent Hill 2, they're not even in the same league. And let's not even talk about the rest of the games in the quote-unquote series that came after number 4. It's probably too complimentary to say they look like tech demos made by a 12-year-old from the slow class that watched Tokyo Gore Police too many times. They're an embarrassment. Or would be to a developer capable of feeling shame. Fortunately, Konami has no such weakness. See, Silent Hill 2, or more broadly the first 3 Silent Hill games, they're a perfect example of why sometimes, in order for a story or setting to work, it requires the mystery to remain intact. It's hard to know which is which before it gets ruined. Sometimes little bits of reveals can make a good story or setup even more convincing or work better. Warhammer 40k, Harry Potter are good examples of this. The more you learn about them, the more fascinating and immersive they get. Endless rabbit holes to explore. Other times, you might not realize how much of what's making a story really click behind the scenes is the vagaries or unknowns that are left up to your imagination to fill in. The best example of this, maybe of all time, is Star Wars. I never understood just how much I did not need or want the details or history of things like the Jedi, the Clone Wars, or the broader galaxy to be filled in until it started to happen and the entire universe ended up just feeling less fantastical and more boring the more it got explained. The fact that every movie after the original trilogy was irredeemable filth did not help either. Rarely is the answer or explanation for any unknowns or mysteries left in a movie or game or anything like that going to be better than what's in your imagination. And when they are, a very large amount of very rare talent is required. You know Silent Hill suffers from this because the more they try to fill in details or explain things or force them to make sense, the less interesting and dumber it gets. The way those first 3 Silent Hill games don't make sense is very integral to why they're good. Naturally, the more games they made, the worse it got, and the more they fell into the modern trap of attempting to tie everything together and explain things that were never meant to be explained in order to brute force a very irregularly shaped IP into the very square-shaped hole of everything needs to be an MCU so it can make more money. And as a result of their incessant, clumsy corporal meddling, they ended up doing exactly what that kind of reckless, profit-seeking, creatively bankrupt rampaging so often tends to do. They unraveled the spell and magic of the original concept behind Silent Hill that made it so fucking cool in the first place. And now that the spell is broken, the series is being revealed as nothing but a few cool-looking yet shallow games lacking any semblance of heart or soul that ultimately amount to little more than a directionless, sad collection of unrelated and transparent attempts to make a quick profit that share nothing beyond the phrase Silent Hill. Otherwise known as just another day at the office for Konami. Though taken to the extreme in that case, what happened to Silent Hill is a relatively common phenomenon in the industry now. The increasingly relentless focus on profit over art has made it so instead of being artistically suicidal, extending and milking a series long past its expiration date is actually fiscally pretty smart. It's the kind of dystopian, melodramatic death of art nightmare that only our modern-day disaster capitalism hellscape could make sound like a good idea. Let's break down exactly why this is done. See, a long-running series has the benefit of any new entries always being received not as an individual game, unjudged on their own merits, but through the lens of the entire franchise with all the emotional baggage and collective attachment that comes with it. A new Final Fantasy game is never viewed completely objectively, purely on its own strengths and weaknesses, in isolation, but instead as part of the entity known as Final Fantasy. All the discourse about Final Fantasy XVI, for example, if you remember, was much more about Final Fantasy itself than that game specifically. This allows a studio to pass off any game that would otherwise be instantly recognized as unremarkable bargain bin slop, as instead something that must be regarded seriously and given the benefit of the doubt, provided that they slap an appropriately popular and well-regarded brand name on it. They've been doing this with Silent Hill as well as series like Call of Duty, Final Fantasy, Resident Evil, and the name Bethesda for years. Call it the 7+ guarantee. Now, the downside to this is that the longer a company tries to push it, if they don't occasionally throw a legitimately good game in there once in a while, the whole scheme rapidly falls apart. Take Final Fantasy and Resident Evil, for example. Both have long worn out their welcome by a factor of years, maybe decades in my opinion. But Square Enix and Capcom, being the clever and devious corpos that they are, knew that they couldn't just make every game with Resident Evil or Final Fantasy on the cover total shit. So they throw in stuff like Resident Evil 7 or Final Fantasy 12 every so often just to help keep up appearances and prevent the brand value from rotting away too quickly. But if you're a fucking retard like Konami, a developer with about as much skill and riz as a bag of smashed crabs, when you try to replicate this strategy with a franchise like Metal Gear, for instance, you do something like releasing Metal Gear Survive. In fairness, on a normal day, that might have slipped one past the goalie despite how utterly devoid of value it was. However, the disastrous departure of Kojima at that time put far too high a profile on it, and Konami, perpetually in a fugue state of greed blindness, released it anyway, despite it having no shot at weathering the current kind of mass public scrutiny it was up against, and that was the end of that. For a little while. Tragically for all of us, the destructive, rampant avarice that motivates all corpos has forced Konami to try again, this time in the form of Metal Gear Solid 3 Remake. We'll see how that goes. With their treatment of Metal Gear as an example, it should have come as no surprise that their signature approach of wild, unhinged, destructive ignorance was on full display in their implementation of this strategy with Silent Hill as well. Instead of releasing a game that on its own would have been barely a 4 as their first follow-up to one of the most legendary game franchises of all time, with Silent Hill, they just mindlessly shit out products slapped with the Silent Hill brand on them so carelessly that they accidentally put it on a few things that weren't even video games. Now there's a new trailer for their Silent Hill 2 remake, so it's time to see how they've improved or adjusted their approach. The good news is that yes, they have. The bad news is that they did it the wrong way. What do I mean? Well, in order to understand my concerns about the Silent Hill 2 remake specifically, we will need to talk about Silent Hill 2 itself, so let's do that first. Silent Hill 2 is almost a perfect game. It's one of those rare few titles that earned itself undeniable legendary status over the years. And in the case of Silent Hill 2, the list of reasons is quite long, but the one at the top of the list, and I'd argue by far the most important one, right next to the story, is its atmosphere. And I'm not simply referring to its use of shaders, certain weather effects, the consistent high quality and cohesive world and asset design, or even the lighting or color palette. All that is, of course, spectacular, but in a very grounded, sober way. What's truly insane about the atmosphere of Silent Hill 2 is how it manages to make itself felt beyond the confines of the screen that you're looking at the game on while you're playing it. The atmosphere is so suffocating and palpable that it almost feels like it's constantly like seeping out to pool around you, as if something somewhere has sprung a leak. It makes things feel like they're slightly out of focus kinda, and that everything is just a little farther away than it should be. The game actually projects this aura that casts the world with a subtle tint of wrongness to anyone sitting too close to it, sort of like the way the edges of a dream bleed into your awareness when you're not fully awake. Somehow, Silent Hill 2 doesn't just look like everyone's memory of a bad dream you couldn't wake up from, it actually makes everything feel that way too. It will drag you in if you're too close to it. To play Silent Hill 2 is to experience it viscerally and feel as though the endless, impenetrable gray miasma is actually in the room with you, nudging you just like slightly outside the normal flow of time and affecting everything with this kind of detached, slightly out of focus aspect of a dream. You can spend hours or just minutes playing it and swear that it had been longer. It's the kind of game that's so wholly engrossing and absorbing that once you turn it off, everybody needs a minute to like shake it off or go outside and get some fresh air. It is exhaustively intense, both gameplay and plot-wise, oppressively unrelenting in its atmosphere and tone, and so universally unsettling and ever-present in presentation and sheer presence that many people won't even want to be in the same room while it's being played. It's simply too draining. Now, how exactly Silent Hill 2 casts its particular spell the way it does, I doubt anyone can say for sure. But one thing I would propose as a definite is that dream logic uncertainty that's tied in so closely to your moment-to-moment experience in the game that it feels like claustrophobic. Maintaining a feeling that the rules of the environment you're in are never fixed and thus there are literally no limits placed on the things that can happen or can happen to you is one of my favorite horror techniques. The cosmic horror element where nothing is completely knowable and therefore nothing, even your own sanity or perceptions, can necessarily be trusted or relied upon, is one I find to be deeply and profoundly disturbing. That's why I love movies and games where once they start, they never really come up for air, so to speak. There's no touch base with an immutable reality to provide even a moment's respite or to reestablish your bearings with something familiar. It's just this non-stop hell ride with no opportunity for any anchor to reality and thus no way to even begin to try to understand or make sense of the things occurring. You're never allowed to be sure what's real. Think of movies like Jacob's Ladder, Hellraiser, or In the Mouth of Madness, or books like Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy. Now, maybe it's all the acid I did when I was younger, but there's something about the primal fear that comes from realizing either physically or metaphysically that you're somewhere you've never been before and can't find the way back that I find just super fascinating and terrifying. Anyone who's ever taken way too much acid will immediately know what I mean. A guy in a mask attacking you is scary, sure, in a very pedestrian kind of way. The rules of the reality we understand allow for things like that to happen, so once the situation is resolved, that's that. It's a very limited and completely knowable and quantifiable amount of danger. But when something occurs that would require the fundamental laws of everything you've come to know about reality to be violated, especially when part of the foundation of your understanding of the universe and your place in it requires that it not be possible for them to be violated, suddenly anything, even the smaller, more seemingly minor events, has the potential to completely unravel your mind. Nowhere is safe, nowhere is known, the concept of sanctuary ceases to exist. That's psychologically intense as fuck, and I love it. It's far more fascinating to me than a masked assailant with a big knife in the dark. That's why I think I'll always love Silent Hill 2 more than Resident Evil, and why I prefer movies like The Void to Friday the 13th. Being an older game from the long ago and the dark aeons before 4K resolution, the lack of fidelity actually worked to Silent Hill 2's advantage. Any game that relies on your imagination to flesh out finer details and fill in gaps left by the limitations of the tech at the time is going to massively benefit, especially a horror game. And when you suddenly bring a game like that into 4K, any weaknesses or rough spots in your design are gonna stick out like a motherfucker and be glaringly obvious, like someone turning on a grocery store style fluorescent light at 2 a.m. when everyone's tripping in the dark. Silent Hill should never be completely in focus like that, because when you suddenly shift everything into glaring HD, it's too much reality, it's too sobering. The hallucinatory vagueness needed to keep everything feeling slightly off balance and dreamlike is shattered. See, Resident Evil doesn't have this problem because it's always been sort of this George Romero B-movie style horror. It's camp.
Freeze! Who are you? What are you doing here?
Hold your fire! I'm a human!
And that relies far more on your basic blood, guts, and gore than any psychological underpinnings or atmospheric subtext. Silent Hill, on the other hand, while certainly replete with its own scary imagery, is far more about the psychological horror aspect and the emotional toll of being immersed in a place where the laws of time and space are in constant turmoil. And that benefits far more from the vagaries of imagination than super high-resolution polygons. And that's why the new Silent Hill 2 trailer looked weird, but in a bad way. Bad the way showing too much of the monster in a horror movie is bad. Rare is the film that can get away with showing a full-length, crystal-clear shot of its monster for longer than a second or two without it being ruined, and this new trailer made me think that Silent Hill 2 is probably the same way. Now, there is good news, though. The good news is that maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it'll be fucking awesome, and you can come back here and downvote my stupid video and leave a comment about how much you hate me, and that will make you feel good for a couple minutes, maybe. But I don't think that's especially likely. I'm usually right. But if this is one of those rare times that I'm wrong, that'll be good for everyone. I certainly don't want the Silent Hill 2 remake to be bad, but as the people's champion, it's my job to be honest with you and tell you if I think it will be. And I do.
Woke up, smoke up, blunt, then I pass out. Pass out. Woke up, what up, smoke up, blunt, then I'm back down. Back down. What? Woke up, smoke up, blunt, then I pass out. Pass out, Woke up, what up, smoke up, blunt, then I'm